Australian Workplace Culture, a guide for newly arrived migrants. In this section of the presentation, we'll be looking at workplace communication styles, asking questions, social behaviour, and fitting in the workplace and community. In Australia, an informal approach to management is also reflected in workplace communication styles. For example, an employee would address their employer in the same manner as a colleague. That same employee could actually make fun of their manager, and this would be regarded as a sign of friendliness, a sign that everyone is equal. But this is a style of communication that is often puzzling for international staff and migrants. There is very little ceremony in Australian workplaces. Directness is seen as being an efficient and therefore a more effective way of communicating in business, particularly in meetings and when negotiating. However, managers use collaborative communication or requests rather than direct commands or orders to subordinates, and there is an emphasis on forms of politeness, particularly when asking someone for assistance. In this case, Australians often use soft forms such as, "Would you mind? If it's possible, perhaps you could." While this may sound like a request, it is still expected that the person being addressed in this way would carry out the task. Australians emphasise the importance and expect the use of please and thank you. Let's take a look at a real-life case study. An example of the misunderstandings which can eventuate between people from different cultures is when email communications broke down between Australian and Singaporean colleagues in a large multinational company. A Singaporean manager sent an email to the Australian colleague saying, "Send me the report by Friday." The Australian thought this was very rude, so he sent the report on Monday. In Australia, because of our preference for egalitarian communication style, managers often don't tell staff what to do. They ask them or preface requests with, "Could you just?" or "If you wouldn't mind." As a result of the late arrival of the requested report in Singapore, the Singaporean thought the Australians were lazy and CC'd the next email to the top manager and said, "Send me the report by Friday. You will comply." You can imagine the response of the Australian business. They didn't send the report at all. In Singapore, it's considered polite to be direct and appropriate for managers to tell staff what to do. In Australia, different notions of politeness are held. This simple misunderstanding escalated significantly, and cross-cultural training was required to sort the problem out. In Australian culture, it is not considered embarrassing or shameful to admit that you have not understood someone or need clarification of the information you've been given. A large proportion of Australians are migrants or have parents or grandparents who are migrants. So in general, we tend to be aware of the language difficulties that new migrants face and will be happy to rephrase or repeat statements when asked. But there is a difference between showing ignorance and asking for clarification. The difference lies in the way you phrase your question. Let's pretend that your boss has cornered you in the office with a project that needs to be carried out straight away. The boss says, "I need you to take on a special project urgently. We're going to be audited and I need someone to go to the finance department and establish how we're going as far as compliance is concerned. You'll need to liaise with the department manager, John. He'll provide you with information about the guidelines that they're supposed to be working by, but you will need to confirm that he's given you the right information and then check through the department records and write me a report on whether they have actually been keeping up to that standard. Make sure you give me specific examples of where they're not adhering to standards, and if you could get it to me by Monday week, that would be great." What's the best way to respond to this request from your manager? There is a lot of information in his or her request that has been given verbally, very quickly. If you did not follow everything that's been mentioned, is it correct to ask for the information to be repeated, clarified, or rephrased? The answer is that nodding, smiling, and pretending to understand when you are unclear will not impress an Australian manager. Not only will it be obvious to your manager that you have not understood the requirements of the task, but they will then not have any confidence that you're able to carry it out successfully. Australian managers tend to look for employees who are confident, assertive, and able to work independently. Asking them up front to repeat parts of the task or to clarify aspects that you haven't heard or understood tends to be interpreted as being keen to do a good job, get it right, and pay attention to detail. Since it also takes confidence and self-esteem to admit when you don't understand, this can actually be a positive way to handle a difficult situation. Just remember to be polite and thank them for taking the time to repeat the information or explain it in more detail. Let's take a look at social behaviour in Australia and in the workplace in particular. Understanding social behaviour in Australia is important so as to fit in well in the workplace and be a happy and productive member of the organisation and your wider community. Areas where migrants might find differences in social behaviour in Australia are in the Australian sense of humour, how people socialise at work, getting on with people, being part of the team, and the importance of sharing interests and personal information in the workplace. Australians have a relaxed attitude to social etiquette. Most Australian social rules relate to expressing equality, irrespective of a person's social, racial, or financial background. So long as this basic principle is upheld, it often seems as though practically anything is considered acceptable. This relaxed attitude of Australians can result in problems. To outsiders, Australians often appear very blunt and rude, lacking in tact, and insensitive to causing offence in others. This can make international visitors and migrants uncomfortable, especially when Australians do not differentiate between people from different social levels and do not use respectful titles or behaviour. Let's take a look at a real example. When Australian cricketer Dennis Lillee was first introduced to Queen Elizabeth II, he greeted her with the words, "G'day, how you going?" Lily's casual approach to social etiquette was a natural part of the Australian irreverence to authority, and Lily probably felt that he was doing the Queen a favour to treat her as an equal. But to many English people, Lily's expression of equality was rude and uncultured. A few years later, at another cricket match in 1977, he was again introduced to Her Majesty and this time asked her for her autograph. The lesson from all of this is that migrants who work hard and otherwise do a great job in the workplace can still be seen as outsiders or as not good team players if they do not make an effort to understand this idea of social equality and take part in the social life of the workplace. Drinks at the pub after work, non-alcoholic if you prefer, and talking about current sporting events or discussing current affairs or even Hollywood gossip can all be a necessary part of getting on with colleagues and being accepted in the Australian workplace. That concludes this session of the presentation. Next time we'll take a closer look at attitudes to work, hierarchy and leadership, organisational communication, achieving success in the Australian workplace, employer expectations, and 10 top tips for skilled migrants. Thanks for listening.